To all, ladies and gentlemen, to this very important event we're holding here at the Global Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., in cooperation with Bay Atlantic University. My name is Paolo von Schirach, and I serve as president of the Global Policy Institute, and I'm also privileged to be a professor of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University. This is one in our series of events where we try to get for you good speakers to talk about important topics that one fashion or another affect us all. Today, the topic is energy, and we are privileged to have with us the representative of the province of Alberta, Canada, who is here at with the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. He will introduce himself, and we will launch into this topic, which is about energy cooperation between the province of Alberta in Canada and the United States of America. And I'm sure he will explain and make it clear to everybody how significant this relationship is at multiple levels. Obviously, business, trade, cooperation between two allied countries and the province of one allied country, which is Alberta, Canada, and energy security. So with that, I'll leave the floor to the representative who will introduce himself, and then we will launch into the topic. The floor to you, sir.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paolo, and thank you to the Global Policy Institute for inviting me to be part of this session here today. Well, I can certainly start by giving a background on my career thus far and my role here, as well as Alberta's role in the United States, because it is unique in many cases to have a subnational government have a presence here in the U.S. So, as was mentioned, my name is James Rajotte. I've been Alberta's senior representative since May of 2020, so over 4 years now in this position. Alberta actually established this office back in 2004, so it's been nearly 20 years since we've been working out of the Canadian Embassy here to advance our province's interests. In terms of my background, again, over 4 years in this role. Prior to that, 5 years in the private sector, in the telecommunications sector. And then prior to that, I spent 15 years as a member of parliament in Canada. So I was elected for 15 years, served 5.5 years in opposition, 9 years on the governing side. And I most notably, I chaired our House of Commons Finance Committee for 7 years and chaired the Industry, Science and Technology Committee for 2 years as well. But obviously coming from Alberta, energy has dominated a lot of the issues at both the provincial and the national level. In terms of Alberta's presence here in the United States, as I mentioned, we established this office 20 years ago here in Washington, D.C. But over the last 2 years, we've opened 3 more offices in Seattle, in Chicago, and in Dallas, and we're up to 11 people in total across the United States. And that's because 90% of what Alberta exports comes to the United States. 80% of that is in energy, which I know you and I will get into in detail. But the size of the relationship necessitates that we have to be here, obviously advocating for our interests. And then the other point I would make in terms of why Alberta is here in a big way, similar to other provinces like Ontario and Quebec, is because of the role the provinces play in the Federation in Canada. It's a federation, not a unitary state, and so provinces have very important roles, particularly as it relates to natural resources. Under the Canadian Constitution, in fact, it allocates responsibility for natural resources to the provinces themselves, which is a big reason why we are here advocating. And in terms of the overall energy relationship, Paulo, I'm happy to launch into that, or did you want to sort of lead off with a question there?
Absolutely. No, I think it's important that you explain to an audience that probably is not, totally deeply informed, how significant is all this? Obviously, as you said, energy is a major natural resource and a business source for your province. Tell us, how significant is that, and why should Americans care? Obviously, you believe they should care, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Your colleagues wouldn't be here. You would not have opened other offices. Please explain to those who think that oil is only in the Middle East, and that's pretty much where it is. It's in Saudi Arabia, maybe in Russia. Yes, and we also have some, but we used to, and not so much. The energy environment has changed enormously, as I'm sure you, of all people, are extremely well aware here in the United States. But how is this significant for us Canadians or Alberta representatives, part of Canada? Why should we care this much? You can explain this better than anybody.
Yep, I'm happy to do so. And you make a good reference point there with respect to the Middle East, because often when we talk to U.S. policymakers, and I'll say to them, who do you think is your number one supplier of foreign energy or foreign oil imports? Most people will say Saudi Arabia. They typically point to that country as providing most of the oil imports. In fact, it is Canada. It's well over 60% of oil imports into the United States are provided by Canada. Almost 100% of the natural gas, a lot of the hydro and other power is provided from Canada. There are 70 pipelines that cross the Canada-US border. There are 35 transmission lines that cross the Canada-US border. Our energy relationship is certainly the largest, most integrated energy relationship, I would argue, in the world. And it is very, very integrated. And even Alberta alone, with reference to Saudi Arabia, Alberta provides more than twice what Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Iraq provide to the United States in terms of crude oil and in terms of natural gas as well. We have the fourth largest reserves of oil in the world. We have the ninth largest natural gas reserves. And so that relationship obviously is very key. If you're an American and you're concerned about energy security and reliability and affordability, then obviously we would say that Canada, Alberta is the answer for that issue. And part of our role is really to explain to US policymakers the size of that relationship. We provide about $60 billion worth, mainly of energy and product, to the Midwest alone. And if you look at certain states like Oklahoma, Wyoming, and Colorado, if Alberta were a separate independent nation, we would be the largest trading partners in the world for those three states. That just gives you some sense of the size of the relationship. And obviously, if you look at things, and I know we'll probably get into more about reducing emissions, that's obviously a huge goal for people on both sides of the border. Alberta has really led in some of the areas like hydrogen. So we do over 2 million tons of hydrogen a year. Carbon capture, Alberta has the largest carbon pipeline in North America. And we've sequestered about 14 million tons of carbon between that pipeline and between another project, the Shell Quest project. I'm happy to get into details, more of what the industry wants to do there. And then in areas like methane emissions, Alberta has reached its methane emission targets 3 years ahead of schedule. But if you're looking at the overall North American energy security, we just need to sort of recognize that relationship overall in terms of how integrated our markets are. And also then seek to work together even more, in our view, to act in a geopolitical way to displace oil and natural gas from countries like Russia. Obviously, the United States was importing a fair amount of oil from Russia prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and in Europe as well. I mean, they were relying a lot on Russia for its natural gas. We believe that we could be, obviously, we've displaced a lot of the Russian oil going into the United States. But our two countries together should work to displace natural gas through LNG projects, which we are doing a number of them in Canada, and in the United States, they're expanding. But a lot of our product actually goes to the US and is exported from there to other regions, which is obviously, we think, good for the globe as a whole.
Thank you for that overview. There's a lot to chew on here, but let me focus for a moment on something that I think myself, as my background in international security, you mentioned energy security. Explain more, if you can, elaborate on what that means. I take it to mean you don't want to be dependent on far away foreign sources of a vital commodity, which is energy. For the moment, whether we like it or not, the world, and we can discuss the future, for the moment runs on fossil fuels. Some people don't like that idea, but that's the way it is for the time being. Future, we shall see. So explain better to our audience how significant it is to rely heavily on a country, Canada, and a province, Alberta, which is part of Canada, that is an allied country and contiguous to the United States, as opposed to importing oil that comes on tankers from the Persian Gulf, where, unfortunately, as we see now every day, there is another problem in terms of security because of political issues and warfare that goes on, say, in Yemen. How does that affect traffic in the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf in general? So the fact that we get our imported oil from Alberta, how significant is that?
Bill, that's an excellent question and a good framing of the overall energy security conversation. And this is what I would say to folks on the line here is some very basic key facts. The world uses roughly 100 million barrels per day. And I mean, that amount, people say, well, that may decline over time, but roughly 100 million barrels per day currently is used of oil. If you research and check the top 10 oil producers in the world, there are 3 democracies. There's the United States, Canada, and Brazil. I believe number 11 is Norway. So you have 4 within the top 11. But you look at the other nations, they are not nations that are democracies. And obviously, we as democracies should seek to work together to ensure that we are funding the proper things with the monies that we accumulate. When Alberta reaps benefits and revenues from the oil and gas sector, that goes to fund schools and hospitals, and our healthcare system, and a social security net for our citizens, and obviously to support initiatives right around the globe. I mean, these are very good benefits for the people in our province. The same in other democracies because they want to obviously fund programs. Now, I think people in Saudi Arabia would argue that they do that as well. But if we look at some of the actors in the top 10, there are some actors there who have used funds raised from their oil and gas sector for nefarious means. And obviously you look at Russia and its invasion of its neighbor Ukraine is a prime example of that. So we are not using our revenues for that, whereas a country like Russia is, and I would argue Iran as well. And so geopolitically, it is a good thing that the production for us occurs in Canada, the United States, and other democracies. And we should seek again to displace as much of the product as we can from countries like Russia for both crude oil and natural gas because of the monies that are raised and because of then the attachments and the interest that you can have by providing those crucial products to countries like Germany and Japan and others. That's why we want to be more of a source for certainly natural gas to those countries than say Russia is at the current time. And energy is such a huge part of all the economies across the globe is that we need to ensure that as much of that product is produced, developed, shipped from countries like the United States and Canada.
Thank you for that. Now, of course, you of all people obviously are extremely well aware of the dramatic transformations that have taken place here in the United States in the last, say, 15 years due to the development and then, how can I say, refinement of hydraulic fracturing, right? The United States was in a very extremely difficult position, say 20 years ago, when people say, oh my God, we're running out. There's no more oil, let alone gas. We're done. And then comes fracking, and that changed the environment significantly to the extent that now the United States is the largest, correct me if I'm wrong, to this day, the largest producer. Obviously, producer and exporter are two entirely different things. Producer of oil in the world and gas too, I believe. From where you are, and you're looking at this significant technological development, which increased supply very substantially, but you still know, obviously, as we all know, that America, notwithstanding this, is not self-sufficient, hence the relationship with Alberta. Do you think that, do you foresee any significant changes in terms of domestic U.S. production, which in turn would influence the imports from your province? Do you see this volumes coming to the U.S. as stable, growing, decreasing? What is your sense, considering all the factors involved, particularly the production of domestic U.S. oil and gas?
And the production, and you're absolutely right in terms of the U.S., the shale revolution that occurred really transformed the domestic oil and gas industry in the United States, similar to, and I think your listeners probably know, I mean, Alberta has the oil sands, which some of that is mined, but there was a technological development similar to shale, which is the directional drilling and pumping steam down into the earth to actually separate the oil from the sand underground and then pull the oil out. And that allows a lot more access to the product and obviously causes a lot less disturbance to the surface area and to the Earth's surface. So that's obviously from an environmental point of view, it's a positive thing. But in terms of the overall supply and production, I think Texas produces about 5.5 million barrels per day. Obviously, people should check that number, but Alberta is up to about 4 million barrels per day. So that has doubled since 2010. Our premier has advocated that we increase that production. And obviously, we move a lot of that by pipeline to the United States. But there was a pipeline that was just expanded to the West Coast, which is moving now a lot more product to areas like Washington State, to California, and is now shipping to Asia. So now countries in Asia can receive crude oil from Alberta. And that's an important strategic point as well. And so when you ask, is it stable or is it growing? At this moment, it's been growing. The demand for our crude has been growing, and not only in the sense because it's a product that is still in very high demand, but it's also the type of crude oil that is produced in Alberta. It's a heavy crude, and so a lot of the refineries in the United States, particularly in the Gulf Coast, have a high demand for heavy crude. It's a crude that you can get a lot more products out of than a sweeter or lighter crude. And so it's in high demand in the United States and it's in high demand in Asia as well. And so we just see that growing. Now, could we double oil production in Canada? We'll see. But I think you'll see it inch up more and more, especially as you see that pipeline capacity increase to the West Coast. And then obviously we'll see what happens in the presidential election. Former President Trump is saying that he wants to increase domestic production, in part to lower overall prices. But even under the Biden-Harris administration, oil production is at an all-time high in the United States. So I think under whatever the result is, I think you'll see the production continue to increase. Maybe perhaps at different levels depending on the outcome, but I think you'll still see it increase.
Let me thank you. This is really important. But I think another point that is critical. There is obviously a position taken by environmentalists, people who want to push for a more rapid transition to green tech, green technologies, renewable energy, etc. And some of them said, oh my God, the Canadian stuff, it's heavy, ultra polluting, it's the worst of the worst. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't import that stuff because it's bad for the environment. It degrades the environment where it's being drilled and brought to the surface, and we shouldn't be part of that. I mean, these are somewhat extreme positions, obviously, but I'm sure you encounter this kind of, head-on criticism probably every day, depending on where you go. What is the best thing you can say regarding the alleged heavy environmental degradation, damage caused by extracting and marketing later on the kind of crude you have, which is heavy crude, as you described?
I mean, one thing I would say right at the outset is we encourage everyone, including very harsh critics, to actually come to Alberta and see firsthand for themselves. Because on one side of the environmental side and a lot of people will point to the mines that still operate, and obviously that's a certain percent. It's about 20% of the oil sands is mined. About 80% is through the other process where you pump the steam underground. But come and see the reclaimed areas that used to be mined that have been reclaimed. And the Alberta government has actually sanctioned and said, yes, this is fully reclaimed area now. And you've got all sorts of wildlife returning. This is something where if you see for yourself, an area of, and this is in the boreal forest. I mean, if you see sort of natural boreal forest and you compare it to an area that's reclaimed, I think people will be very impressed by what the companies themselves have done and the government has done to ensure that has happened. But in other areas, and obviously in your question, people are concerned about emissions. And so the industry itself has reduced emissions on a per capita basis about 22% over the last number of years. So they've really aggressively tried to reduce emissions. They've done things like cogeneration as well in terms of their power supply. But they have also, the 6 largest oil sands companies have formed an organization. It's called the Pathways Alliance. And this group has committed to net zero by 2050. And their first large project will be a carbon capture project. Again, another large carbon pipeline, which will seek to capture the emissions and sequester them. And this is an area in which Alberta has shown some real leadership. We just had our carbon conference in Edmonton. We had actually some folks from California come up and speak and obviously learn what we're doing there. Because as I mentioned, we've sequestered 14 million tons of carbon. We have world-leading technology on this. We are a little envious of the incentives that have been introduced on the US side of the border, but both the provincial and federal governments in Canada are trying to respond to, again, incent companies to capture the carbon and sequester it. We have a bit of an advantage, and this is getting a bit technical maybe for the US audience, but in Alberta, the land is what's called provincial crown land. So the province actually owns the land. And so we've actually, we've done some requests for proposals to actually have these carbon hubs. And so a company can apply to manage a carbon hub, and then other companies can apply to store their carbon in those hubs. So this is something I think very progressive that's happening in the province as well. And in other areas, so I mentioned methane emissions. So Alberta committed to reduce its methane emissions 45% by 2025 from 2014 levels. It met those 45% reduction targets by 2022. So we met them by 2022. We met them 3 years ahead of schedule. And we're looking at further emission reduction targets as well. And on that, something is, as your listeners will well know, methane is one of the, is regarded as, perhaps the most harmful greenhouse gas. And so that's something that we've even talked to John Podesta's team at the White House. And obviously they're very progressive and want to see methane emissions reduced. And so we've talked to them about how we can further work with them on reducing methane emissions. But in other areas as well, on geothermal, hydrogen, this is an area, geothermal. Alberta has some companies that are Ever Technologies is really leading in this area. They just opened a facility in Germany. That was our environment minister went over, but the chancellor of Germany was at the opening of this facility. And a lot of the skills and technical capabilities of the oil and gas sector transfer well to the geothermal industry. And then on the hydrogen side, as I mentioned, now our hydrogen would be, if you use the colors, gray hydrogen, which is industrial, or blue hydrogen. We produce some because we capture some of the carbon, but we're producing an awful lot of hydrogen and obviously using that for heating or for transportation. These are areas that we're talking to a lot of US states and US organizations about to address some of the emissions issues. And there we have a Hydrogen Center of Excellence. We have a convention in the province every spring. We have a partnership. Our Edmonton Airport has a partnership with Toyota. They have 100 vehicles doing hydrogen from that center. We have a long-haul truck facility just near the airport as well in hydrogen. So we are investing a whole lot into these new areas to reduce emissions in a very global way.
Great. So basically, I mean, again, based on your explanations and descriptions, you would say that the environmental footprint of this extremely large, at scale, a really huge industry and facilities that you have in your province to responsibly drill and get the product out and then onto the pipelines or wherever it goes to its final destination, that the environmental footprint is not significant, at the very least. You would say that, and diminishing, given all the measures that the industry is taking at various levels, including methane capture. So is that your assessment so far? That's that people shouldn't really worry so much about, oh my God, this is the worst of the worst.
On the methane side, as I mentioned, there's been some real achievements made in terms of reducing emissions on the methane side. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, I think the industry itself would acknowledge that the oil sands industry itself has high greenhouse gas emissions and needs to dramatically reduce them. And that's why they put together this Pathways Alliance group. Their CEOs meet every week to talk about what they need to do to move forward. And it's why they're looking to governments to partner with them on the credit side. Again, similar to what the US has done on the Inflation Reduction Act to really capture the carbon and store it. And Alberta has very good geology to do so. So this is something that we do recognize we need to meet it. We need to move aggressively to reduce those emissions. And we think carbon capture, utilization and storage is the way to do so. And maybe one other thing I'll mention in there is we are participants in the Carbon X Prize, which we think is a fantastic goal-setting organization that obviously tries to fund innovative research. So last year, a number of our companies participated, and if folks come to Alberta, we would take them to a place called Carbon Upcycling. And what they do is they take captured carbon and they turn it into product that they can use for construction materials to actually enhance construction materials. And so these are the types of innovative things that Alberta is willing to participate in a very big way. And then this year, we're actually looking at participating in the Carbon X Prize on lithium, and we can get into critical minerals because that's very much part of the energy security conversation. But I think overall, we recognize the emissions are high, they need to come down, and we're working hard to do so, both at the government level and at the industry, to partner to make that happen.
Thank you. When you mentioned carbon capture, you also said something about you got good geology for storage. Where does it go? In other words, once you manage to suck it in, so if I can use this maybe inelegant expression, where does it go? How do you dispose of the CO2 or other?
Yeah. So it's pumped underground and generally stored in aquifers, but Alberta has very good geology caverns to store carbon. Now, some of it is used for what they call enhanced oil recovery. So you pump carbon in to get more oil out of that field. But some is simply stored in carbon because of the geology is very conducive to doing so. And my understanding is Alberta itself, its own geology, could actually store all the world's carbon that's been produced to date. That's what we've certainly been told by our regulators and by geologists in Alberta. So it's a very good conducive structure to store carbon.
All right. Well, that's a luck of geology, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you for all this. Now let's get to if I may, the difficult subject, and you probably know what's coming. Keystone XL pipeline. We know. Well, I know a little bit, and I'm sure you know everything. You can explain it to everybody. It's been a very delicate topic, symbolically so, and unfortunately, because I, as a layperson, I cannot understand what's the fuss. But obviously, you know the fuss, and you know what a big headache this has been and quite frankly, to some extent, poisoning, or at least damaging the bilateral relationship. Particularly, again, the argument against the pipeline, which should transport the oil from Alberta down to the refineries that you mentioned earlier in the Gulf of Mexico. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, some of them were built to refine Venezuelan heavy oil. Am I correct on that? Please, exactly. You can elaborate. But which, by the way, now considering the conditions of the Venezuelan oil industry, it's talk about suicide. But anyway, so tell the people who don't know maybe anything at all about the pipeline, and it's a tortured journey through years and years of studies of environmental impact, of sustainability, and this and that, and what we should tell on the onset, that because this is a pipeline that goes across international boundaries, it became, in a statutory sense, the responsibility of the State Department, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to rule on it, and we go back now to at least to the Obama administration. Tell us the story. Tell us what the issues are and why such a big fuss about a pipeline.
Yeah, no, and it was canceled in first day of the Biden administration, and which was my first year in this role. So I know the issue very well, and I'm happy to give some history on it. So there's a
Please.
Keystone pipeline system that takes oil from Alberta right down to Cushing, and then obviously right into the Gulf Coast. And as you mentioned, a lot of the refineries in the Gulf Coast area were actually refurbished to focus more on heavy crude, because you get more products out of a barrel of heavy crude. You can actually get up to 6,000 products out of a barrel of oil. I don't know how many people are aware of that. But anyways, they wanted to take more products down.
Sorry, say it again. How many products can you get out of a barrel?
You could get up to 6,000 products out of a barrel of oil, right?
6,000.
So yeah, because of all the derivative, the derivative
Sure.
products that occur, even whether we use our iPhone or eyeglasses, surgical, like everything that involves obviously the petrochemical industry at some point comes out. Asphalt, all of our roads obviously come out of barrel of oil. So with respect to Keystone, there's a Keystone system that comes down to Alberta, takes product down to Cushing, and Cushing has a lot of Alberta product goes to Cushing in Oklahoma, which is why we're their number one trading partner, and then goes into the Gulf Coast. And there was a higher demand, so the company at the time, TC Energy, proposed to build sort of a shortcut and to add a pipeline that would have added about 850,000 barrels per day of capacity. It was proposed. The State Department, in its initial sort of reviews, was actually, we thought, quite favorably disposed to the pipeline and thought that it did meet standards. Obviously, it had to negotiate with landowners through the states that it was going through. But the Obama administration did not support the pipeline. And because the pipeline crosses the Canada-US border, it requires a presidential permit to cross the Canada-US border. So that President Obama did not issue that. President Trump gets into office, and one of the first things he did was to issue presidential permit for that pipeline. The challenge then became it got tied up in a lot of legal issues, and in one particular courtroom in Montana, which tied it up for years, actually. And so that delayed the project getting started. But once those were somewhat resolved, then the company restarted that. And actually, the Alberta government itself invested in the project to try to move it forward as quickly as possible. In the final year of the Trump administration, the company built about 10% of the pipeline. The pipeline had crossed the Canada-US border. And so our view was it's crossed the Canada-US border under an existing permit. A future president should not be able to come in and cancel a previous permit and have to cancel a project that's actually 10% complete. So again, that happened. The election happens, and then the President Biden gets elected, and on day one revokes the presidential permit, and so the project had to stop. But further to that, because again, it had 10% complete across the Canada-US border, the company at the time was just going to leave the pipeline, bury it, and then if a change of administration occurs 4 years later, perhaps revive the project. But it's my understanding that a judge out of Montana said no, the pipeline actually had to be removed from the ground. So TC Energy had to remove that entire project out of the ground, take the pipeline out. So TC Energy has said they will not build that project in the future. Now, it gets a bit complicated here, but the challenge there was this is a pipeline project that had committed to power all of its generating stations along the pipeline with renewable energy. It had signed agreements with 5 Canadian First Nations, so our Indigenous peoples had become partners in the pipeline project. It was negotiating with 6 to 8 U.S. tribes on the U.S. side in terms of getting their participation in the pipeline. So from an environmental point of view, and moving crude oil by pipeline versus moving it by train, which is what now they're moving a lot by train because they can't move it by pipe. It's a much better way to move it by pipeline. It's quicker, but it's more environmentally friendly to move it that way. So that was the argument. And then from a geopolitical point, which you referenced earlier, is, I mean, it's preferable for the United States, in our view, to get its crude oil, its heavy oil, from Canada rather than from Venezuela. And we have a common expression in Alberta. It's, Calgary, Alberta is a lot closer than Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and it's a lot friendlier than Caracas, Venezuela. And so we should obviously have a preference. And one of the things we say as Canadians is, it's a bit odd for us because we are arguably the only country that faces an infrastructure test or a presidential permit to get our product into the United States, whereas Venezuela can have it shipped up, or Saudi Arabia. And so we say, as best friends, neighbors, and allies, that we should actually be a preferred source for that, as well as we talked about in our previous segment, the environmental standards and all the other labor standards and everything is much better. And in fact, one of the strongest groups that supported the pipeline project was the labor movement. So the building trades on both sides of the border, the Teamsters, were very supportive and very actively encouraging the Biden administration to keep the pipeline. So it's very unfortunate that that happened, but we do now have a pipeline, as I mentioned, enhanced to the West Coast, to Vancouver and Burnaby area. And some of that product is going to Asia. There was a previous pipeline in Canada, the Northern Gateway Project, which was northern British Columbia. If the government changes on the Canadian side, would a future government look to revive that project? But again, we would prefer to ship the product to the United States rather than to Asia. But obviously, we'll have to search for the customers where we can find them. And then maybe just to finish up, so TC Energy did sue the Biden administration, and the Alberta government also initiated a lawsuit. The TC Energy lawsuit has been dismissed, as I understand, and ours has not been dismissed, but we'll see what happens. We did launch the lawsuit under the former NAFTA agreement rather than the new USMCA. But it's now, in terms of moving maybe I'll just finish with this, is moving more product down. Perhaps companies could look at just enhancing existing infrastructure, like rather than building a new pipeline, maybe they could just enhance the Keystone route. And that's what happened in the case of Line 3, which is an Enbridge pipeline that went through Minnesota. So that pipeline, I think they tripled the capacity of that pipeline along the existing route rather than building a new route, which obviously requires a lot more environmental assessments.
If I may, thank you. From what I hear from you, this issue is now dead, and it probably is not going to be revived. But I think it's important, I guess, for our audience also to understand that the arguments, of course, the vehement arguments against construction or the enhancements, basically, of the flow of oil from your province into the United States, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's not, the idea was, oh my God, this is really terrible. We shouldn't do this. And I remember distinctly, correct me if I'm wrong, because I may not be accurate. I remember when it came to the final decision by President Obama, who delayed and delayed, and then the State Department had the review, then he had the review of the review, and then a final assessment in which the State Department concluded, correct me if I'm wrong, this project is neither good nor bad from an environmental standpoint. It's not, essentially, it's neutral. In other words, it doesn't change anything for the better or for the worse. But President Obama said, hey, we are here, we're all committed, now we're going green, we're just about to go to Paris, right? This was the big COP meeting, the failed Kyoto Protocol, and say it doesn't really look good correctly. They say, it doesn't really good. The optics are bad that we go there, proposing a new world of green energy, and then we authorize a pipeline that increases our consumption of crude. It doesn't really look good. Is that more or less the way it was? And that therefore was a political position rather than something fact-based that says, this is really going to cause significant environmental damage, and therefore we think we shouldn't do it. Is my reconstruction correct, or am I missing something?
My sense is that it was that analysis is correct in the sense of, I mean, it was a political decision not based on what the State Department had determined or based on the facts from an environmental point of view. It was a political decision, and the pipeline itself, and I think the company would say this is Keystone XL became sort of a big, large symbol and a test, almost a litmus test for especially President Obama is, are you in favor of action on the environment or not? And if you are, you have to cancel this pipeline because it's become such a big symbol, a bigger symbol than our view it should have been in that way. So unfortunately, it did become more of a political decision rather than a fact-based one. And I think as well, and in terms of the future project, I don't see that specific project being revived, but I think you could very much see more product moving. And again, former President Trump has talked about increasing domestic production in the United States, but a lot of his people are at least sort of indicating that they'd be open to some kind of a pipeline or more energy infrastructure from Canada. My sense is that would be more along existing routes, perhaps expanding existing routes or maximizing those routes rather than building a new pipeline. But there is a possibility of more product moving down and those pipelines being enhanced in some way.
Again, let's clarify once more. You mentioned this, but for our friends who may not be familiar with all this, the product gets moved anyway, right? So with existing pipelines and also by rail, which to my layman's understanding, it's more expensive and potentially more dangerous. In the past, not recently, thank God, there have been a couple of huge incidents, right? Of trains colliding or something, or losing control, and major explosions, and crude going all over the ground. So I would say from a safety standpoint, and quite frankly from an environmental standpoint, a pipeline beats transporting crude by rail. Is that correct?
It does, and this is where now the railway companies would, if they were on with us, they would argue that they have a very safe record, and which they do, obviously. But in terms of moving more product more quickly and moving it in a more environmental way, on a fact basis, it's better to move it by pipeline than by rail. And there have been, to your point, I mean, we saw the situation in Canada, in Lac-Mégantic in Quebec a number of years ago. You had some real tragedy with rail cars with crude oil. And so there have been those types of situations, which again, the railway industry would say that's obviously not the norm, but any way you move this product is challenging. And this is why there's another pipeline, Line 5, that goes through Michigan and Wisconsin, and it goes from Canada to the US and back up to Canada. And that shows a lot of our product goes back and forth across the border. But the governor and the attorney general of Michigan wanted to shut the pipeline down. It's an Enbridge pipeline. It's been operating safely for 60 years. But the issue there is there's people in northern Michigan who take propane that's off that pipeline. And so you're going to have to get them propane some way for the winter. If you don't move it by pipeline, you're moving it by rail or by truck, other ways. Like, people do need that product to survive, in winter in northern Michigan. So it's going to get there some way. And again, as we referenced earlier, 100 million barrels per day, that's the demand for the product. And that's not declining anytime soon. So who should be providing that? As we would argue that jurisdictions like Alberta, like Canada, the United States are ones that should be at the forefront of providing this product.
We're getting close to the end of the time allocated for us, but let's try to put it all together. And I know it's complicated. And first of all, thank you so much for the clarity of all your very thorough explanations. So what I'm getting here is this: for the time being, like it or not, whether you're for or against it, reality is that we still depend pretty heavily on fossil fuels. And we can talk, I'll ask you in a moment about what your forecast is in that regard. And that being the case, and that's, I'm with you 100%. My own opinion is if you have to depend on some level of imports, of a vital commodity without which we're really dead in the water. There's nothing that can substitute for it. You better buy it from a friend in an allied country or province in this case, part of a country, Alberta, part of Canada, rather than, as you say, Riyadh, the saying that you have there in Alberta about getting stuff from Saudi Arabia or from Venezuela. And Venezuela is a case in point. To the best of my knowledge, Venezuela has the biggest oil reserves in the world, right? More than Saudi Arabia, which is astonishing. And look where they are. The country is half destroyed because of, political incompetence and really mismanagement, which now goes many years. Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, all their problems. Now you had another rigged election. In the meantime, with this incredible source of wealth stays there and it's not exploited because of politics. I don't think we're going to have Maduro-like government in the province of Alberta. At least I don't wish it on you. it would be a bit of a challenge. So that being the case, I think there's merit in cultivating this relationship. But let's try to move forward a little bit in the time remaining. We know that oil and gas are finite resources. At some point, I know not now, not today, not in 10 or 20 years, but they'll be gone. And as Sheikh Yamani, I remember, many years ago, I'm sure you remember, he's saying when but this is long, long ago, he said, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, right? And the oil age will not run out because we ran out of oil. Something else will come. Now, of course, the world is committed to going green, but everybody talks about a transition to renewable energy. In a month and a half, there will be COP29. I'm sure you know that. And in Baku, Azerbaijan, and there will be big discussions about the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. It's very hard to assess any of this. It's extremely complicated, thousands of moving parts. How soon do you think that this transition, which obviously will affect this enormous industry in your province and clearly south of the border here in the United States? I mean, how do you see any breakthroughs in green energy and renewables that will say, okay, this is it, we're done. Oil and gas, well, yes, in a couple of years, it's all over. I'm exaggerating, obviously. What's your assessment based on what you know about global technological developments and innovations in the space of energy across the board?
Yeah, that's a very big question, which the globe is obviously grappling with, and jurisdiction like ours are grappling with. I think, though, our sense is the world will continue to use oil and gas in very substantive ways for decades to come and be part of the huge energy mix. And what we need to do, though, is to diversify the energy mix. So yes, Alberta, very large oil and gas producer. We also have the two largest solar projects in Canada. 90% of the renewable projects in Canada last year were in the province of Alberta. We use the highest amount of wind per capita in southern Alberta. So we are doing a lot of, I mentioned geothermal before, so we're doing a lot on the renewable side. One thing we have to recognize, though, is you have to partner renewable with baseload generating power, and we believe the best is natural gas. We actually transitioned away from our last coal-fired facility this year in Alberta, and that's now moved to natural gas. But the other thing to really think about is we are going to need far more energy than we have today. So we need to actually add sources of energy, including renewables, but we would argue natural gas. You look at the amount that all of the people on this line are using data centers, and if you look at artificial intelligence data centers, I mean, you've heard different numbers, but I think at least 6 times the amount of energy is required for an artificial intelligence data center. And so that demand is there. Alberta wants to attract a lot of these data centers, but you then have to provide a power source that's not interruptible. And that you need baseload generating power. And I think natural gas is another huge area where, again, we should be exporting that to countries like Germany, Japan, Greece and others that have asked for increased natural gas so that we're not enriching countries like Russia. And I would say on transitioning away from oil and gas, our government's view is emissions are the issue. Like we need to go hard at reducing emissions rather than reducing the product itself if there is demand for that product. But I think the reality is the world is going to be using a lot more energy as we move forward, especially with more artificial intelligence, and we're going to have to provide it in some way. And again, increased renewables is certainly part of that solution, but I think fossil fuels will be part of that solution for decades to come.
Thank you for that. Hey, let me, yes, try to clarify if I can for our audience, something that I was really stunned to learn not too long ago. What you just mentioned in passing now, that because of the increase in the number of AI, artificial intelligence generating facilities, we are projecting here in the United States, Eli, that we will need 6 or 7 times the electricity that we're using now, which is astonishing. We certainly don't even remotely have the capacity today to power these enormous and energy hungry or thirsty, whatever we want to say, data centers that will power artificial intelligence. The news was just a few days ago that Microsoft has cut a deal with a utility managing whatever is left of 3 Mile Island, a nuclear reactor, which, those who are a little older will remember was the worst nuclear accident in the United States at the time, which nothing really happened, but it was close. It was a close call. And then now they're reactivating a reactor, and Microsoft said, thank you very much, we'll take all your electricity. That's a lot of electricity. Yeah. So they already have a contract or finalizing a contract. And this is just illustrative of the enormous, voracious appetite for additional energy. In the past, we used to think the mature economies are wiser and better, more frugal in the way they use energy, that we don't waste so much, and that therefore energy consumption per capita, as we become more technologically sophisticated, actually diminished. Whereas now we are facing totally the opposite scenario. So that supports what you were saying. There will be need for more and more electricity, and that means the availability of 24/7 supply, which the moment wind and solar cannot provide, but unless they're backed by something else, whether it's hydro or gas or something else. So your conclusion would be, yes, we want to be more, how can I say, cleaner to the extent that it's possible. And as you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, you say, let's not say we don't need oil and gas. You say, let's try to make oil and gas cleaner to the extent that it's possible. Did I get that right?
You have that right, and let's make it cleaner, and like you made a very good point about we're just going to need far more energy going forward. I mean, the amount of energy we use, I think it's about 10,000 megawatts our grid, and about 12,005 at the high point. But this is just, it keeps increasing, right, in terms of the amount that are using. And yeah, in certain times a year, I mean, this is in Alberta, the sun is out till 10 p.m. at night, lots of sunshine, so solar is very reliable. But in January, December, I mean, obviously it's very short days. We're sort of northern part of the continent. And so you don't have solar, and often you don't have wind. And then we have temperatures of minus 40, and minus 40 Celsius is the same as minus 40 Fahrenheit. And so our grid almost failed. And if you have a failed grid at those temperatures, you're having some real harmful things happen. And so you need a grid, to your point, that is 24/7. And that's why you need renewables, but you need to partner it then with the baseload power like natural gas, or if you have hydro, that's fantastic. We don't have hydro in Alberta, so we need another baseload power like natural gas to ensure that grid operates.
I think we're almost at the end now, and we thank you so much for enlightening all of us with very crisp and detailed description of the industry, of the relationship, and we wish you good luck with continuing, in your effort to explain that Alberta is not in Saudi Arabia or whatever. It's not in the Middle East, and that why that makes a difference from a geopolitical standpoint, international security standpoint, energy security standpoint, especially given the news that unfortunately we're getting every day from the Middle East. It's not very reassuring. And if North America depends so much as it does on fossil fuels for the time being, it wouldn't be very reassuring if we had to import it from Iran, which not exactly a friend. So on that note, I would like to thank you so much for being with us, for taking the time to speak to us, and best of luck to you in your work.
Well, thank you very much, Paulo. I really enjoyed our conversation, our discussion, and yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this interesting conversation here today.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, on behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University, I thank you for your attention, and we stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.